So we'll get right into my beefy presentation. And I think a main takeaway of tonight is I want everyone to feel like they can understand the full scope of Champagne and really understand all the different possibilities. I'm going to cover a lot of information here, but I want to do so in a way that feels accessible, that we can all understand. So it'll kind of be a high-level presentation, but hopefully it'll make sense. And if anyone wants to reach out to me later, here's my email is nick, N-I-C-K, @mediumplus.com, or you can send me a text message or a phone call, 206-369-4927. I'll share that info later as well. But let's get into it. So we'll first start off by talking about the Champagne region and how the region is put together. This is a picture that was taken in my cellar some time ago, and there's a bunch of cool different styles. I think Champagne is really my favorite region, and the price range of a bottle can go anywhere from, let's say, $40 on the introductory level up to, to be honest, $4,000 or $5,000. But I think the best quality can really be in that $50 to $75 range. And usually those really expensive ones is a function of rarity more than anything else. But let's not get into that quite yet. We can first talk about the Champagne region itself. And this might be France's most famous region. Some would argue that Bordeaux could be equally famous, or maybe Burgundy. But this is my friend Madeleine's wine map here from Wine Folly, and I love her maps. I've drawn a circle around Champagne, so it's in that northern section. It's just about 90 minutes east of Paris. So in theory, once travel is back open, you could fly into Paris, and let's say you arrive in the morning, you could be in Champagne that afternoon. And most likely you would plug in Reims into your maps. So that's spelled R-E-I-M-S, and they would pronounce in the region Reims or Reims. Kind of just it's one big vowel almost. Reims. And it's at 49 degrees north in latitude. If we draw a line across the world, that would roughly be the same as Vancouver, BC, or Kiev, Ukraine, or Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. So that's kind of where it is in the world. If you were to draw an opposite line on longitude, that's 4 degrees east, and similar longitude to Amsterdam, Algiers, Lagos, and much of the Atlantic Ocean. So that kind of gives us an idea of where in the world it is. From Seattle to Reims is 5,000 miles in a straight line. And then if you keep going east, it's another 5,000 miles to Beijing. So in theory, you could do a nice little hop over, go start in Seattle, then fly to Paris, visit Champagne, and then maybe go to Beijing and try some good food. Plenty of good food in France, though, too. Next are the subregions of Champagne. So just like any wine region in the world, it's a bit like a Russian nested doll, where there's one doll inside of another, inside of another, inside of another. And so in Champagne, there are actually 5 sub-regions inside of the major region. And each has its own personality and its own style. The most famous would be the ones in the north: the Montagne de Reims, the Vallée de la Marne, and the Côte de Blanc. And those 3 subregions have villages that have been rated very highly, either as Premier Cru or Grand Cru. Now, in other places in France, let's say in Bordeaux, if it's Grand Cru, that's actually the winery estate that's rated Grand Cru. Or if we're in Burgundy, it's the vineyard area that's rated as Premier Cru or Grand Cru. So Champagne is different. It's actually your village that you live in. The vineyards of that village are rated. And it's been kind of a hotly debated thing over the years, and there have actually been riots back in the day over this whole rating system. Because you'll notice that two of the subregions were left out, the Saison and the Aube. So, there's a lot of great wine coming out of there, but it's a lot of smaller producers, usually more budget friendly, and very good wines, but not as famous as these other regions. So these 5 again: the Montagne de Reims, Vallée de la Marne, Côte de Blanc, Côte de Saison, and Côte de Bar. So we can do a little brief history of the region in points that I think impact style. There's a lot of different parts of history, and we're not talking about the wars, and we're not talking about the riots that much here. Tom Stevenson has done a lot of great writing on Champagne, and I would recommend Tom Stevenson or Jancis Robinson for resources on reading about the region. But some bullet points on how the styles have evolved over time. There's a winery called Gosset, which is considered the first real winery in the region. They date back to 1531. So this is the 16th century. We're kind of still in the Middle Ages at this point. And at that time, they were not making sparkling wines. They were making still wines. Sparkling wines came roughly 100 years later. And there's a record that dates to 1622 where the first purposeful, on-purpose bubbles were being produced. And later on, the first official champagne house was considered Ruinart. So those who are studying wine might learn Gosset and Ruinart as being both firsts in their own way. The first major champagne wine label was Cristal, and it was first created as a private label for a Russian czar. And there's a whole story behind Cristal in that it had a flat bottom. We call the bottom the punt. And the czar was afraid that people would hide explosives or bombs in the punt of the bottles and try to get him. So he demanded that the punt be flat. And Roederer first created Cristal in the late 1800s. And it first became a commercial vintage. It wasn't until 1945. 2 other very famous wines, Salon and Dom Perignon. Those labels came out commercially in 1921. And those are all negociant houses, which we'll get into in a little bit. In 1971, that's when my mom graduated high school. Is that right? That's when the Club Trésor was founded. And this is a group of grower producers which teamed up and wanted to promote their wines. In 1979, the famous single vineyard wine from Krug called Clos de Menil. That was the first year of that. And then going into the modern natural wine movement in 2012 with raw wine, that festival, which was created by a master of wine named Isabelle Legeron, the first year of that was in 2012. So we have really a long history that continues to change. In this image, gentleman in the cellar is working at the pupitre, which is a way of moving the yeast that's in the bottle for secondary fermentation. It moves it towards the neck of the bottle. I will admit, we're not going to really get into the whole champagne process in this presentation. We're more talking about the end product of the different styles. So we'll have to do the champagne process in depth another time, but it all relates. So just a couple quick notes about the featured wines, the Extra Brut and the Second Nature. So I would say that the Extra Brut might fit more into a traditional champagne taste. It has a lot of richness. It's has a big brioche kind of toasty flavor that comes from aging in the bottle on the lees from secondary fermentation. It's a blend of Pinot Noir with a bit of Chardonnay and Meunier. And roughly half the wine comes from the 2014 vintage. And the rest is a reserve blend that's been replenished since the 1960s. So the winery is 6 generations long, and they've been keeping this reserve where they will deplete some of the reserve every year and then replenish it with new wine. And so maybe a drop or two in your bottle comes from the 1960s. The Second Nature is a bit more of a modern natural wine style, which I would call it 0-0. There's no dosage, so no added sugar to sweeten the final wine, and also no added sulfur. So sulfur is an important stabilizing element in wines and helps keep wines fresh and intact and and protected from things like bacteria and yeast and things that can spoil a wine like oxidation. But because Champagne is a wine that has a lot of tartaric acid, especially a Brut Nature style, that acts as a natural preservative to keep the wine fresh. And so this is really a pure wine in that 0-0 natural wine style. Also a blend of Chardonnay, Meunier, and Pinot Noir. I'll tell you that all of the wine comes from 2016, but it's technically not a vintage Champagne because vintage Champagne has to be aged for 3 years in the cellar to meet that regulation. This was aged a little bit less than 3 years, so it doesn't carry the vintage on the label. So a question about the reserve wines for the perpetual in the Solera. It is sort of a pseudo Solera, and we think of Solera often in the sherry region where you'll have a series of barrels, and the oldest barrel is called the Solera, and that will be used to bottle the wines, and then the Solera will kind of be fractionally refilled from other barrels. This is sort of like that, but it's basically one tank, and the wine is drawn off. Roughly a third of it is drawn off every year, and a third is replenished. So it's not really a series of tanks, so I wouldn't call it a Solera, but it kind of acts in the same way where there's wine that is from long ago that is commingling with newer wine. Okay, so we have some sweetness levels, and it looks like some of my text might not be showing on this view here. Esther, I might change over to the Google Slides format. Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so we had oh, I see what's going on. Okay, well, that's all right. I think it's just that one slide. So Champagne, the opposite of Brut Nature would be like a demi-sec or a doux. So we'll talk about that. So at the end of its aging period, the Champagne is almost ready to come to you and visit you in your home or at your restaurant. But there's usually going to be a bit of sweetness added to the wine, and we call that dosage. And there's so much, it's such a tart wine overall because it's a cool region. The grapes stay pretty tart and they retain a lot of their tartaric acid. The wine needs a little bit of sugar added. That's pretty normal. So the most common style of Champagne is Brut, and that can have up to 12 grams per liter of sugar added. And that's usually beet sugar, to be honest. And they'll get beet sugar from England, and that comes from sugar beets. And they'll make like a liquid syrup, and they'll top off the wine with that. And it helps to soften the sharp edges of the wine. A Brut Nature is allowed to have up to 3 grams per liter of sugar, but that's not added sugar. It might just be unfermented sugar from the winemaking process. Now there are dessert champagnes, and these were famous in much a higher degree in the, let's say, mid 20th century. You would look at a menu at like Camless Restaurant here in Seattle from 1950. They would have much more in the extra dry, sec, and demi-sec levels. And the taste back then was of a sweeter palate. These days, it's kind of gone to the opposite, where sugar is kind of bad and we're all anti-sugar and let's have these dry wines. And I see Instagram ads for wines that have the least amount of sugar possible. So we're kind of stylistically in a different era, but I think that if made properly, like sweet things can be delicious, and I love dessert. So, so there you go. So let's talk about some examples of these champagnes. The most common is the Brut non-vintage style. And most of you might recognize this logo. It's Veuve Clicquot yellow label. And this might be the most famous champagne in the world. I think it's a worldwide brand, a bit like Coca-Cola or McDonald's, where this image would probably be recognized as far as Hong Kong or Lagos or Argentina. You could be in Buenos Aires and probably find yellow label. So it's I think it's a very important wine, and it's amazing that they can make millions of bottles and have it taste consistent no matter where you are in the world. So it's pretty impressive how they do that at Veuve Clicquot. So I think highly of the wine, but it is sort of a soft, rich style that, to my view, is a crowd pleaser. So it may not have some of the nuances of other wines, but that's okay. It really shows what champagne is all about to maybe a first-time drinker. My first champagne, I think, around the time, I think for college graduation, we had champagne in the car, and it was Veuve Clicquot Demi-Sec. So not the Brut, but the Demi-Sec. Some other famous Brut non-vintage styles would be Moet and Chandon Imperial, Louis Roederer Premier, or Krug Grand Cuvée. And these don't carry a vintage, so it's a blend of reserve wines from different years. And it's Brut, meaning there's anywhere from 0 to 12 grams per liter of sugar added. And it's probably a blend of different grapes. So there's probably Pinot Noir, Meunier, Chardonnay, maybe some others. Usually, most champagne that's made is majority Pinot Noir, followed by a next larger portion, Chardonnay, followed by a bit of Meunier sometimes, and then maybe small fractions of other grapes, which are allowed, but very uncommon. So the Brut non-vintage style, I think, is the essential foundational style. Brut Nature. Now, just like the Bonnet Pensant Second Nature, Brut Nature has no sugar added, and it tends to be favored more by growers who want to express sort of this sense of purity and raw terroir. And terroir is the sense of place. So it has to do with the climate of the region, maybe the soil type of the vineyard. It could be the angle at which the vineyard gets sunlight. It's all these elements of the place affect it, and growers want to maximize that sense of terroir. So they might not add sugar, and it's often common for them to put the village or vineyard name on the label as well. So in this case, Georges Laval, definitely one of the rare producers on the grower side. Brut Nature from Cumier Premier Cru. Now, Louis Roederer is one of the few Négociant producers that does Brut Nature. We'll talk about Négociant a bit later, but they make a Cuvée Stark, which is a collaboration with a French artist. And then Drapier does an unsulfured Brut Nature as well. Okay, the next level of sweetness up allows for anywhere from 0 to 6 grams of sugar. So Vouet et Sorbet, they are a grower in the Aube region. And a lot of these wines that are in quotes, this is just sort of the fanciful name. So Fidèle is the name of this one. Also Jacques Casson 741. That's they do like kind of a different cuvée series. And so there's like 740, 741, 742. And that's always extra Brut. And then the Bonnet Pensant Cuvée Perpetual is also extra Brut. Now, we talked about Brut here earlier. So it actually goes Brut Nature, extra Brut, Brut, and then it goes to extra dry. So the way that I remember this is the extras are on either side of the Brut. There's extra, extra. Extra dry is getting into the sweeter styles, and it's really not common. I think the most famous producer is going to be Piper Heidsieck. They're a Négociant producer, and they make extra dry, and it's widely available. You might see older bottlings of extra dry from Paul Roger or GH Mum, but I've never seen one in person. I have seen the extra dry from Piper. Next is Sec, and probably the rarest Sec wine from Champagne is by this unicorn wine grower called Jacques Salos, the Exquise. If you ever see one, call me because I want to try it. Another great Sec wine comes from Taittinger, and they call it Nocturne. So if you want to learn, if you're like crazy like me and you want to learn the grams per sugar levels of these, it's pretty easy. It's just, you just remember 0, 12, 17, 32, and 50. And that's kind of my trick for remembering it. So Brut Nature, 0 to 3, extra Brut, 0 to 6, Brut, 0 to 12, extra dry, 12 to 17, Sec, 17 to 32, Demi-Sec is 32 to 50, and Doux is 50 plus. And, you know, I don't think anybody in their right mind needs to know that. And So that's why I learned it. Next is demi-sec. And this is a pretty common style. I think anyone who's thinking of dessert champagne would go for demi-sec. It's delicious. I like it. Laurent Perrier makes a great demi-sec. That's pretty common. The one in the picture here is a grower, A. Margain. They make a demi-sec Premier Cru. And then Nicolas Fouillat, I don't know about this name, Delicious. That's the demi-sec wine. Now, probably the rarest style of champagne, which I've never tried actually, is called Doux. This is a dessert champagne with over 50 grams of sugar per liter. So my mom is clapping to that one. I think I have one in the cellar. I just haven't opened it. I have the Pierre Gervais L'Unique. Apparently, Veuve Clicquot makes one called Riche. And Henri Beaufort is I think it's a grower. And they have all these old vintage Doux champagnes. So they're kind of unusual, and I recommend trying those for sure. You might have to visit the winery, though, because they're pretty uncommon to see in the States. Okay, so those are the sweetness levels. We've already covered a ton of information, and, let's keep going. We're doing great. I'm going to take a sip. Okay. The next area is vintage and non-vintage champagne. Usually the fancy champagnes at the highest level are vintages. And the growers have... Now, okay, the reason that vintage champagnes are so special is that in most years, historically, Champagne is a very challenged region. The climate is really poor. It's kind of not always super consistent. It can be cold. It could be rainy. So if they get lucky and they have a year where there's good weather the whole time, the fruit might turn out really good. They might have a big harvest. They'll choose to bottle a vintage champagne that year. So it's kind of a rare special thing. Now, Dom Perignon, they bottle more vintages per decade, I think, than anybody else because they want to make a lot of money. But if you ever see a Dom Perignon with Enatech on the label, consider trying that because those are very special. But if you ever see a vintage champagne, 100% of that wine came from the year that's on the label. But on the other side of it, let's say for 1993, the winery is required to keep 20% of the wine in the reserve so that it can help out in future years in the non-vintage blends. You need that high quality fruit to help bolster weaker vintages. So it's kind of like on a sports team, like you always need like strong players to round out the beginners. You don't want all beginners or all strong players. So they keep in reserve some strong vintages to help with the blends. The non-vintage wines can be very good though, and they often highlight a house style and are consistent from year to year. Usually there are 3 vintages, give or take, in the blend. We talked about the perpetual cuvées, and then there are some producers who do real Solera style. So like Jacques Salos Substance is an example of a Solera champagne, or Berèche, I think it's Reflet d'Anton is their Solera style. So that's usually done by growers in a very small quantity who are actually blending from barrel to barrel in that real Solera style. That's pretty rare. And then you'll have, instead of non-vintage, like Krug likes to say that their wine is a multi-vintage. So that's where like they don't have any weak vintages in their blend. They're all good vintages. So they call it a multi-vintage wine. They think they're super fancy. But you know what? That's why the wine is so dang delicious, Krug rocks. So that's a term that you might see in marketing is like multi-vintage. They're basically a fancy non-vintage wine. Okay, so within, it can be vintage or non-vintage. Most of the time, champagne wines are a blend of different grapes. So a blend of Pinot Noir, a blend with Chardonnay and Meunier. You'll often see Pinot Meunier written. That's kind of the old way of saying it. Just saying Meunier is like the modern way of saying it. So if you want to be fancy and modern and hip, just say Meunier. So a Blanc de Blanc wine will be a champagne that's made with all white grapes. Usually, this means that it's all Chardonnay, but there are Blanc de Blanc wines which are other grapes. The white grapes of Champagne are Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, Petit Melier, and Arbegne. So you might see a Blanc de Blanc that's made from Arbegne. That's very rare. There's hardly any Arbegne grown. There's like one soccer field's worth of Arbegne in Champagne. It's like nothing. So you're probably not going to see an Arbegne unless it's from Moutard, and we'll get to that later. But it's probably Chardonnay, and it's probably from the Côte de Blanc. The Côte de Blanc is an area of Champagne that has the best Chardonnay vines. And Suenin, you can see the up close label here. The village is called Cramont. The parcel is called Les Robarts. It's a Blanc de Blanc, so it's all white grapes, single vintage, extra brut. So what I'm hoping is that from this presentation, you can see on the label that there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different sort of permutations going on with this label. There's the sweetness, the vintage, Grand Cru Vineyard, Blanc de Blanc, single parcel. It gets complicated, but let's make it not complicated. So Blanc de Blanc is all white grapes. Blanc de Noir, these are all black grapes, like black skin grapes or red grapes. And here's an example from Cédric Bouchard. Rose de Jean, Côte de Béchalin is a Blanc de Noir. So you could have a Blanc de Noir that's all Pinot Noir. There are Blanc de Noir wines which are all Meunier. So those are pretty important. And the difference between Blanc de Blanc and Blanc de Noir stylistically is real. Blanc de Blanc tends to have kind of more brightness, freshness. It's more feminine, I'd say. Blanc de Noir is more chewy, textured, more kind of masculine in style, has more of a full body taste. And the way that they achieve a white wine from red grapes is through gentle pressing. So that's a pretty careful technique that the wineries have to use. Okay, next is rosé, and most Champagne is a blended rosé. Some of my favorites are from Billecart-Simon, Ruinart, and Krug, and it's very difficult to make a consistent rosé wine because they want, Ruinart kind of wants the same color profile year after year, and it's very difficult to achieve the taste profile with the color matching. So oftentimes rosé Champagne are more expensive than any other Champagne. Like Krug Champagne rosé is like $300 a bottle. I think it's quite pricey. So Billecart-Simon and Ruinart are not as expensive. I'd expect to pay maybe $75 for those. But they're up there. And these wines are unique because oftentimes they're blending still base wines, red and white together. And that's not allowed anywhere else in France. Usually in France, rosé is made by soaking the grapes on the skins and then draining them off the skins, and there's your rosé. These are actually finished white and red wines that are being mixed together, and that's very rare. It's the only place in France that allows that. Next is Saignée Rosé. So this is made a bit like you would expect to see other rosé wines in France, where the grapes are crushed. They spend a small amount of time soaking on the skins to extract the color, and then they're drained off of the skins and bottled, or not bottled, but aged. So that draining is called Saignée. It's bleeding off of the skins. That's a style that's usually favored by growers. So blended rosé is usually more négociant. Saignée Rosé is more growers. And we'll see a list of growers here: Jean Vaisselle, Vouet et Sorbet, Larmandier Bernier, and René Jaffroy. These are all growers who are doing this Saignée style. And these Saignée wines tend to have a very dark, rich, intense color. Kind of almost approaching a red wine sometimes. Now we're going to get into the difference between NM, RM, CM, and MA. So we were talking a bit earlier about négociant and growers and these different things. You'll see on every champagne label a tiny code where I'll actually show this to you on my video. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll show you on the video where it says this. So, all right. Okay. So on Bonnie Ponson, there, it's right there. It's this RM. It's this tiny little code. And I'm sorry that the camera may not be picking up that detail super well, but it says RM there. Okay. Versus here's a Perrier-Jouet Belle Epoque, and this should say NM somewhere. And it's usually in very small type. That's about like 4-point font. So you'd expect to see NM on here, and I don't think it's on here for some reason. They're supposed to. So look at that. Bingo. This is for when you're at the club. Got that Belle Epoque situation going. So, okay, let's get back to the slideshow because I want to explain this. NM stands for Négociant Manipulant.
No, not sharing your screen.
I'm not sharing it. Okay. This is like complicated. All right. Okay, we're back. So négociant means they're buying the fruit. So that's kind of like picture like a restaurant. Your typical restaurant, they buy their produce from a wholesale produce supplier. So in Seattle, we have a company called Charlie's Produce, and they sell produce to all the restaurants in Seattle. Now, if you're a certain kind of crazy restaurant that grows your own crops and makes everything from scratch, you're growing the food and you're also cooking the food. That's kind of like the grower champagne people. They're growing the grapes and they're also making their own wine from that fruit. The négociants, mostly they're buying the fruit from small growers, and they might have some of their own vineyards too. CM stands for cooperative manipulant, and that means that a bunch of growers get together, they pool their grapes, and they make the wine under a single label. You might have seen Nicolas Fouillat. That's a pretty famous CM. And then MA is a custom label. So we have a store called Costco. They have their Kirkland signature Costco brand champagne, and that's a custom label that's made by somebody, and they just put their own label on it. So, Mom, I'm going to pour you some more champagne here. There you go. Cheers. Okay, so let's get into these. MA. Here's Kirkland signature, Marc d'Achter. It's basically a custom label. You know, Costco didn't make this wine. They bought it from a bulk wine, probably a co-op. I don't know. But they put their own label on it. I'm sure this tastes fine, but it's not going to have, it's going to mostly be a sparkling, bubbly wine. And that's about it. But as it says on the label, a classic champagne, bright, elegant, and intense. So there's that. CM, so this is the cooperative manipulant. The most famous CM producers I can think of would be Mailly Grand Cru, Nicolas Fouillat, and Jacquart. And I'm not seeing the CM. They keep that code kind of hidden. I want to see one with it. Okay, NM. Most champagne producers are NM, and they're usually the famous brands. And to make enough wine to have enough champagne for the whole world, you have to buy enough fruit. So that's why they're NM. So Taittinger, Henriot, and Pommery are some examples. Question here, négociants also grow their own grapes as well as purchase. Is there a set percentage when they need to declare as an NM, or is it any amount? Yes, it's 5%. So if you're a grower, you're allowed to use up to 5% of your fruit as bought fruit, and that's kind of a insurance policy, so that if you have a terrible vintage, you can still buy some fruit from your neighbor. If it's anything over 5%, you're in the négociant category. So There are a lot of negociants that have 20 or 30% of their own vineyards, but they have to have that NM label, and that'll appear on all their wines. RM, maybe my favorite category. I don't really discriminate, but I love RMs more and more because they are awesome. They are growing their own grapes, and they are making the wine. We can decode this label now that we have our foundation in place. So the brand name is Agrape. They're from a Grand Cru village called Avies. In this case, Venus is a single parcel within Avies. The sweetness level is Brut Nature, and then it's all white grapes, so Blanc de Blanc, probably Chardonnay. We can talk a little bit more about these Grand Cru and Premier Cru villages that get all the hype. Grand Cru, they'll usually appear on the label because the producers want to highlight the fact that they're using fancy fruit. So some famous Grand Crus to think about: Embonnet from Rhin, Aï from Vallée de la Marne, and Luminous Rosé from the Côte de Blanc. And in the picture there, that's Salon, single vintage wine from Luminous Rosé. It's a Blanc de Blanc wine. And if you look at the very bottom of the label, you'll see the NM code, NM-300-001. Some famous Premier Cru: Chamery from Montagne de Reims, Cumière from Vallée de la Marne, and Virtus from the Côte de Blanc. Okay. So next up are some single vineyard wines. And it's common not to just include the fact that it's from a Grand Cru village, but it's from a special parcel within that village. I think the most famous single parcel wine is probably Le Chétion from Pierre Peters. Brut, Blanc de Blanc, single village, single parcel, single vineyard. It's a single wine. Some other favorites: Venus, Crayère from Elie Aurier, Tattinger, Folie de Marqueterie. So these are single vineyards, but then if you put a wall around the vineyard, you can call it a clos. So these are like the famous, super fancy parcels: Clos de Goisse, Clos d'Ambonnet, Le Clos Saint-Hilaire. These are vineyards that are supposedly surrounded by a wall that a monk built while he was drinking the wine in 1804. There's a very romantic idea there. But these wines are typically single vintage when they appear on a label. And like, for example, Clos d'Ambonnet, it's only been made like 4 or 5 times. In other years, it just gets blended into Grand Cuvée. There's this idea of, I took that picture, Micro-Négoce wines, where these are negociant wines where they're buying the fruit, but they're produced at a very small level. So Barèche et Fille, they have a side project called Raphael and Vincent Barèche, where they're buying the fruit like negociants, and they have sort of the spirit of a grower with the fiscal policy of a negociant. Now, Bollinger, I love Bollinger. They do all kinds of crazy wines. One of them is called RD, and these are usually single vintage wines, which just sit in the cellar for 15 or 20 years, and then on demand from probably the importer or whoever, they will disgorge these wines. So I think 04 might be the most recent vintage of RD, but these wines are sitting in the cellar on their yeast for over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And they just sit there and someone waves a wand and they go disgorge it, and they're delicious. So Disgorged On-Demand is a niche style. I'm sure that there are undisgorged wines at most champagne places, but they're usually not commercially available. If you happen to be a Russian czar, you can probably get that taken care of and order some Disgorged On-Demand champagne. If you know any Russian czars, let me know. Now, I call these revived vintage wines, where these are recently disgorged wines from very old vintages. and they're frightfully expensive. So like Dom Perignon P3, it used to be called Enatech, like we saw earlier with the 1993 Rosé. But P3, that's a 1969. I think it was just released like last year or the year before. It goes for like $4,000. That's crazy. But it's a super old vintage that they have in the cellar, and I think they taste the wine before bottling it and then release it. Cristal has a version of this called Vinatech. So that's a pretty unique deal. And it's only being done by these super well-to-do wineries who can afford to keep their wine for 70 years or whatever it is. For, what is that? 50 years. Tête cuvée. This is a thing that's common more with negociant producers. They have very elaborate packaging, usually. So there's Nicolas Fouillat, Palme d'Or. They're a CM producer, cooperative. You know, wood boxes are common, fancy bottles. They're expensive. I think a lot of it's marketing. Like in that wine, the Palme d'Or, it's a good wine, but probably half the price of the wine is in its packaging. So take that as it will. But they tend to be very delicious, age-worthy wines. You could buy a bottle of that and age it in the cellar for a long time. Usually single vintage, not always, but usually. Special Club. Now, founded in 1971, the Special Club is now, I think it's 29 or 30 growers who team up, and the best wine that each grower makes gets the Special Club label. So they're not blending between producers. Like Marc Hebrard, that winery made its own wine, Special Club, but this is the best wine that Marc Hebrard winery makes, and they use that same bottle type with the embossed glass, and they use that kind of label format, and those are very good grower producer wines. So that's kind of the tête de cuvée of these growers who are in the club. We've got a couple more slides of unusual styles now. Ungrafted vineyards. So these are pre-phylloxera vineyards that are kind of planted in sandy soils. And phylloxera was an insect epidemic that happened at the end of the 1800s that basically wiped out all the vineyards of Europe, unless those that were planted on sandy soils or located in the middle of the ocean, like on Tenerife in the Canary Islands or Madeira. So there are a couple places in Champagne that have ungrafted vines. So that's a neat style. Look at the top of the bottle here on Comte Audouin de Dampierre, and it uses a Twine Muselet. So instead of a wire cage, it's using a twine cage of sorts, and that's a very old school style. This Cuvée Prestige from Dampierre comes with scissors, so you can snip the twine. So that's fancy. And there's a couple producers who do this. It's not common at all, so pretty cool. Some use, instead of twine or a wire cage, the Agrafe Staple, and this is a metal staple that hooks onto the bottle. It's called an Agrafe, and you just have to kind of peel off one edge of it, and then you can pull it off. You'll actually see this quite a bit in Lambrusco production in Italy. So if you ever try to open an Agrafe, just sort of lift up one side of it, and it should come off. There are different bottle sizes that Champagne can come in, from as small as a split. Was that a split? No, it's, what's this name of the super small Champagne bottle size? A Piccolo. I think it's called a Piccolo. I don't know. It's teeny tiny, 187 ml, all the way up to like a Nebuchadnezzar, I think is a 15 liter. And usually the wines that are either super small or super big are just a basic non-vintage Brut. It's not common to see other wines that are unusual. You wouldn't usually see like a vintage Blanc de Blanc Brut Nature in a Jeroboam size, which is that's a 3 liter. So it's usually just the basic Brut of a production, but it's cool to have a big bottle. Now, you saw this with my Perrier Jouet Belle Epoque. It's with a LED light up deal, perfect for the nightclub. Dom Perignon does this as well. So definitely a marketing deal, but I guess it's cool. I'm into it. Unusual grapes. So there are some producers who make these super rare white grapes, Pinot Gris, Petit Melier, Arbein, and Pinot Blanc. So they are planted in super small amounts, like the size of a city block or less, which is not enough to make a whole lot of wine. But Drapier makes Pinot Gris, Duval-Leroy makes Petit Melier, Moutard makes Arbein, and Pierre Gerbet makes Pinot Blanc. So that's pretty cool. And you can see on the Arbein label down there, it says Cépage Arbein. Cépage just means grape variety. So grape variety Arbein. Single vintage. I can't tell if it's Brut, but it's definitely Blanc de Blanc. Vieille Vin means old vine. Now, just in terms of broad style, you have super old school producers, which have been around for forever. So Gosset has been around for like 20,000 years. So they're in kind of the old school negociant camp. I'd say like Ruinart and Roederer are in that. And their styles tend to be richer and fuller, maybe a higher dosage overall, kind of a roundness to the classic toasty champagne. And they're contrasted by kind of the new school. And we would call these maybe raw wines, natural wines. Often there's organic viticulture going on, new techniques, maybe biodynamic. In this case, the large Peugeot wine, Bees, it uses honey for the dosage. So there's honey made from the vineyard bees, and they collect the honey and use that to sweeten the wine. And it was very controversial. All the mucky mucks in Champagne were all upset because they didn't think it was allowed. And anyways, the Bees is a pretty cool wine. And bees means kisses in French, but it also sounds like bees. So some of these raw producers, Bonnet Ponson, I'd put in that camp. You would expect to see them at the raw wine fair, Vouet et Sorbet. And yeah, they're delicious. They're bright, detailed wines, usually produced on small levels compared to the negociants. And here we are. The ultra rare unicorn wines are usually growers. And if you have any of these in your cellar, let's talk, and I'll come down and we can try some. Ledru, Georges Laval, Salos, Ulysse Collin, Cedric Bouchard. They're kind of B-side producers. Like most people don't know these names. They're kind of insider names, but they're very expensive, usually $200 to $500 per bottle, something absurd like that. And they're made in tiny productions, and they're hard to find outside of France even. So like Marie-Noël Ledru, I've had twice, I think, and I think both occasions were direct import from France, like somebody put it in their suitcase. So that's pretty neat. We have just a couple more non-sparkling styles to talk about. One is called Coteaux Champenois. So this is a still wine, like a red wine, a white wine, or a rosé without bubbles that comes from the region. So a great white wine might be the Le Large Peugeot Vrigny Meunier Blanc. So it's a red grape, but they're making white wine out of it, and it's a still wine, so no bubbles. Elie Aurier, they make a great Pinot Noir from Ambonnet. And there's actually rosé made as a non-sparkling. So Pio Sevillano Meunier. That's pretty cool. Style from the Aube, so in the southern region, is a still rosé made from Pinot Noir. And definitely Olivier Oriot is the main producer of that. So no bubbles there either, rosé wine. And then the final one is a dessert wine called Ratafia. And this is pretty delicious. It is a vin de liqueur. So it's raw grape juice with aged brandy added. And then that mixture is often aged for longer. You'll often hear a vin de liqueur called a mistel. And this is common in other parts of France, like in Pinot de Charente is another common example, or Mac Vin du Jura. And I really like the Geoffroy example. You also see Moussefi and Jacques Delos make some. And I think that's it. So, so let's talk a little bit now about. I'll put my my video on so you can see me talking, and we can speak a little bit more about the wines themselves and any questions you have. If anybody wants to talk and use their voice, you can. But maybe I'll start. If you want to just leave a thing in the chat, Esther can field the questions for me, and I'll talk about the wines. So let me give you some of my super fancy master sommelier tasting notes on the Extra Brut. Now, when I'm breaking down any wine, I'm going to look at it in three ways. There's the visual, so how the wine looks. There's the aroma, so how it smells. And then the palate is how it tastes. So on the visual, the Extra Brut has some color to it. It's a little bit hard to tell in this light, but it has almost a golden color. And that golden color, it's a bit like when you cut an apple in half, and it's like a Granny Smith apple, and you leave it on the counter and it turns more towards a gold or a brown if you leave it out long enough. Same like with an avocado turning brown. And that comes from oxygen. And in a small way, oxygen is what is somewhat contributing to the color in this wine, because it spent 4 years aging in the bottle. The oxygen was able to give it some color. The grape juice can also have some color to it. And if it's a Blanc de Noir champagne, some of the color can come from the skins itself. So that's what I noticed here. It's got some color. On the nose, it's aromatic and has, has a fruit profile, a lot of yellow apple. There's non-fruit kind of, I get a lot of toasty bread, like a brioche kind of thing. That's a pretty classic champagne note. This is a pretty floral wine. A lot of kind of yellow flowers, daisy and daffodil, Scotch broom kind of thing. And then on the palate, that's where I think champagne really sings, because it's usually a tart wine, and I like tart things. This is very bright, but it's also round at the same time. So there's direction with the brightness, but there's also kind of this round mouthfeel and body to the wine, which is really nice. And one thing that's kind of hard to measure is that the wine lingers. There's a taste that sticks around for a long time. So that's what we'd call the finish of the wine. And there's a long finish here that is delicious. So I would say that the Extra Brut here is a great anytime wine. So you can have it on its own, for aperitif, cocktail hour, breakfast, good breakfast wine. Now I'm going to make some room in my glass for the Second Nature. Let's open that up, and I'll give you some tasting notes there. And while I'm opening, I'll multitask that there was a 20% requirement to hold back a vintage in the reserve. So that is a legally mandated requirement from an organization called the CIVC. And the CIVC is kind of like the IRS, but for champagne winemakers. They don't like the CIVC because they're these like kind of bureaucratic rule makers, and they're not much fun. But they mandate all these rules. And ooh, there's the sound of it opening. You hear that? Oh, it was a little bit eager to. Did anybody else have that happen tonight? It kind of, here, I'll get it off of my keyboard. Brut Nature wines can be foamy sometimes, but delicious. So yeah, the 20% requirement, if it's a vintage year, they want to bottle vintage wines, they do have to keep 20% for future years to keep as kind of a backstock just in case. Thanks, Esther. Okay, so on appearance of the Second Nature, it's a much lighter color, and the lighting here may not show that very well, but The Second Nature is a younger wine. It didn't spend as much time in bottle, and it doesn't have that tank aged reserve wine. Ooh, look at that, high tech. So the color's bright. On the nose, this I would say that, okay, I like wine tasting in shapes. So the extra brut to me is like a circle. It's kind of, the edges are rounded off, and it's like a circle. This is more like a triangle. It's more pointy. And on the palate, it's very bright, pointy, kind of zingy. The fact that it's a Brut Nature is obvious to me. There's a lot of tartness on the palate. I think this is a great food wine. So Brut Nature styles have a sourness to them that really counteracts richness in food. So we're talking lobster mac and cheese, stuffed crust pizza, clam chowder, like classic champagne pairings. But really, I'm serious here. This is a great food wine, and I guess those are the kind of foods I eat, so that's what I would pair with them. You know, we think that champagne has to go with like oysters. I love oysters, but it doesn't have to be these super delicate foods like oysters and caviar and, you know, baby birds or whatever. Like, we can have these rich kind of classic foods. You never heard of ortolan, Mom? My mom is cracking up about ortolan, but okay, tangent. Ortolan is this sort of barbaric French dish where you eat like a deep fried baby bird all in one go, and you have to like cover your head in a veil so that you're like hiding your shame from the Lord. Like, I'm serious. Look up ortolan. Fried chicken. Sam said fried chicken. Speaking of fried birds, fried chicken is good. Hong Kong style fried lobster is good. Kind of Szechuan influence is a bonus if it's spicy. So part of what's nice about champagne is the bubbles kind of counteract things that are spicy or big flavors. So that's a nice thing. Let's say you have a sweeter style like a demi-sec or a doux champagne. When doing dessert pairings, the wine should be sweeter than the food itself. A perfect example of this is when people do like chocolate and red wine pairings, and they do like milk chocolate with a Cabernet Sauvignon. And it's actually a pretty difficult pairing because the chocolate has bitterness as well, and a dry red wine like a Cabernet is also bitter. So it's like bitter on bitter, and it actually is a bit of a contrast. If I were to do a thing with chocolate, I would do like a vintage port or a tawny port, something like that, where it has those fruity flavors that we get in chocolate, but it has the sweetness to act like a hug around the bitterness. So if you have bitter foods, you need to give it a hug and soften up those rough edges. Yeah. So for champagne, if we're doing a sweet champagne, I would do a lightly sweet dessert. So we're talking lemon bars, sugar cookies. What's the sugar, like a Girl Scout cookie? Not a Samoa, maybe a tag-along could be good, or something like even fresh fruit can be really nice, like berries or mango, something like that. Tropical fruits can be really good with champagne. Let's see here. As far as getting serious with champagne, and like if you want to deep dive into high-end stuff, this is the progression. And if you have more questions, please let Esther know. But this is the progression that I think most people go through if they're getting into champagne and wanting to like do you remember Candyland, that game where there's sort of this circuitous path that you go through, and you kind of start here and there's different things along the way? That was basically like my favorite childhood game. So you start with a basic non-vintage brut, like Veuve Clicquot yellow label, solid, down the road, negociant style champagne. Then you might check out a couple other negociants, maybe Louis Roederer, maybe Moet and Chandon. Maybe you get fancy and do like Henriot or Paul Roger. But you stick with these non-vintage brut wines and you get to know the different styles, because even within that narrow band of it's brut and it's non-vintage, the different houses each have their own personality. Then you can graduate into growers. And for example, like with Bonnie Ponson, this is a grower that makes wine in a little bit of a leaner style than something like a Veuve Clicquot or Tattinger. So the wines are less hockey player and more ballerina. That's a good example. Or maybe less hockey player and more like jockey, like a racing jockey or like a speed skater. Yeah, okay. So like less Marshawn Lynch and more Apollo Ono. That's a good example. But yeah, no, the grower styles tend to have just sort of a finesse to them and a lot of detail, but they're cerebral wines. They're kind of nerdy, and there's so much text on the label. Like the Bonnie Ponson wines are really cool because they tell you the blend, they tell you all the technical elements of how the wine came to be. They're a little bit more, nerd in the back of the bus kind of thing versus, the negociants are more party up front. I guess it's kind of the opposite of a mullet, which is like business in the front, party in the back. But the negociant styles are approachable. I don't know if anybody likes my jokes, but I think they're funny. The negociants are approachable. The growers are a little bit more just cerebral and nerdy. But I would start with checking out growers that you can probably find in any market in the country. You can probably find Brut NV if you're looking. You can probably find Charton Taillé, and you can probably find Agrafe NV. Bonnie Ponson is available here in Seattle. I can ship around the country. It's available in California and in New York. So there's 3 different importers that are working with the wine, and these guys have been around for 6 generations. So there's a long family history, and they're all organic, and they take care of the land. And I think the wines are delicious. But it's kind of like you have to know the name to think to get them, versus there's more shelf appeal and recognition with some of the bigger producers. Is there another question there?
It's a comment.
Okay, so I'll just read the comment. We tend to think of champagne with special occasions, but the occasion is already special. The wine is secondary. That's why I like to drink champagne with things like pizza, as it creates a special occasion rather than following it. So I drink it on Wednesday, in my honest opinion. So I agree with that totally. And I love contrasting fancy wine with simple food. And we kind of talked about that earlier, but doing champagne with things like pizza or burgers or mac and cheese, I think is great, because anywhere in the country, there are great neighborhood restaurants that make the best mac and cheese you've ever heard of. Maybe in the Southwest, they're doing like green chili, New Mexico, Santa Fe mac and cheese. And in Boston, they're doing, oyster mac and cheese. I don't know if that's a thing, or here in Washington, we might do salmon mac and cheese, whatever. Wherever you are, if you have a wine that's super special, maybe it's champagne, maybe it's white Burgundy, it doesn't matter what the wine is, but you can bring a special wine and have heartfelt food with it. That said, there's nothing quite like being in the region where the wine is produced. And there's an old food pairing idea called what grows together goes together. So we think of like with sherry wines, having, salty olives and almonds and little sardines and things with the sherry, or maybe in Germany, having schnitzel with Riesling. Like, oh, that sounds good. So having foods that come from the region are really good. I actually don't really know what comes from Champagne, but I know they like cheese, and Champagne sure is good with soft cheeses. There's a question here. Yeah, Boston is lobster mac. I feel that. 100% Meunier is a style that is pretty cool because Meunier, it's a red grape. It's grown in, okay, here's my map of Champagne. Up north is the Vallée de la Marne, and it's kind of this mountain, or excuse me, Montagne de Reims is up top. And then there's this river valley called the Vallée de la Marne, and then the Côte de Blanc, and then the Aube is down south. So the Vallée de la Marne, the climate's a little more crummy, and they plant Meunier there because Meunier, it can grow in less favorable conditions. So you'll see more Meunier come from Vallée de la Marne, and that grape may not have as much detail as Pinot Noir, but it is similar. And so you'll see Meunier done in Rosé. You'll see Meunier done as Ratafia. You'll see it done as Coteaux Champenois Rouge, rarely. And you'll see it done as a Blanc de Noir. And there are some great Blanc de Noir Meuniers. So like Le Large Peugeot, Meunier des Cléments, Charton Taillé, Meunier Les Bars, Elie Aurier Meunier Vin de Vrigny. These are world-class champagne wines, and they highlight the character of Meunier, and it's a contrast to Pinot Noir. It has more of a fleshy, kind of fruity foundation, and it's not as perfumed. It's a bit more chewy and rustic, but it can be very good.
More questions here?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll read the question here from Norman. Mention about vintage or mature wine that has been in the cellar 10 or 20 years, somewhat oxidized. Should we avoid these or treasure them? So there is a question about champagne that maybe was bought at the store or from the winery 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I'm not sure if I have any bottles here at the moment. But Esther, may I ask you a favor? The binder on the shelf here, the fifth one in. Yeah. Okay. I love old champagne. And when I'm saying old champagne, it's like champagne that maybe was bought from an estate sale and had been in the person's cellar for like 20 or 30 years. And if anybody ever has to drop off the call here, we might just keep talking for a while. Thank you for being here. I just want to say thank you all for hanging out and listening to me talk for an hour and a half. I appreciate you joining, and we can do this again. We can talk about Australian wine or sherry or whatever you want. But champagne happens to be a favorite of mine. So old wine is really cool because it develops a whole different type of flavor, and the texture of the bubbles change. Usually it loses a lot of its mousse, a lot of the foam dissipates over time, but I kind of like that. I don't mind flat champagne. It tastes kind of like Chablis, you know? So old champagne can be really delicious. And one of the best examples, I'm looking for the label, is a Philippinat. What's that?
Show your binder.
I'll show the binder. I will. This is one of the projects that, okay, so this is hello class. Here's my storybook. I'll change the angle here. So this is a wine that my mom found at a garage sale for like $5, and it was fine, but it'd probably been from like the 80s, and it was like $4. So these, I took the labels off and put them in a binder, and it's a great way of learning. But this one is what I was looking for. I'm going to take it out. It's a 1983 Philippinat, and that's the top foil, and it's like super long foil. And there's the label, Philippinat. And this is one of the best champagnes I've ever had. It was probably released in the late 80s, I would guess. Let's even just round up and say 1990 is when it was released. That means if I drank it in 2015, it had 25 years in the bottle. It was nutty. It was complex. It was a little bit oxidized. It kind of had that bruised apple thing going on, but not in a bad way. It's kind of like J-Lo. Work with me on this one. Jennifer Lopez. back when I was a youth in 1999, JLo was making music videos. She was on TV. She looked great. I just saw a picture of JLo from last year. 20 years later, she still looks great in a different way. So these great wines, if they start off great, they have the potential of becoming mature and different and evolving into a whole new version of themselves. And this Philippinat single vintage wine, it started off good and it got better. Sometimes wines can start off sort of ho-hum and then with age become great because they sort of have the potential to mature. Sort of like, you know, we know certain people who were late bloomers and they gained more of an expressive personality later in life. So some wines are like that. Others were duds from the start and they started off bad and they became bad later. And others started off strong and then went downhill. So wines are kind of like people or anything else. They can change over time, sometimes get better. And a lot of it has to do with the conditions. And if it's good cellar conditions, that will invite good development. Okay, friend Kyle Fischler, excuse me. Are there any regions in the States that produce sparkling wines on par with Champagne? This is a great question because I think the answer is yes, but it's really producer specific. So it's not region specific as much as it is specific producers. So New Mexico, there's one called Gruet, which makes nice sparkling wines. In the Finger Lakes in New York, they make very nice sparkling wines. Dr. Constantine Frank is an example. In California, in like the North Coast Anderson Valley, there are a lot of champagne companies who have set up shop there. And we have Mum makes wine in Napa. We have Roederer Estate in Anderson Valley makes wine there. But there's a winery called Schramsberg, which is from California, has been there for a long time. They make wine that is on par. In Oregon, there are some great sparkling wines. I like Argyle. They do extended tirage wines. And then even here in Washington State, there are some good ones. I would think of like Analemma is a good grower that makes nice sparkling wine in the Columbia Gorge. So yes, there are great sparkling wines from the New World, but I will tell you, I don't think they taste like champagne. I think they taste like where they come from. A lot of the New World wines have more of a generous fruit profile because they usually come from these warmer climates. There's sort of a special combination that Champagne has of this cool climate with these deep chalk soils and like 1,000 years of winemaking history that the wines taste like champagne. But I think there are amazing sparkling wines also from Germany, South Africa, Italy, Australia. Britain has some great ones. So some producers who I like from Britain, Bolney is good. Nytimber is good. They're really coming up because of global warming. Britain used to be way too cold to make wine, and now it's getting warmer, so they can grow grapes and make good sparkling wine. And the chalk subsoil that's in Champagne extends up into southern Great Britain, into like Kent area. So those White Cliffs of Dover that you may know about, that's that same kind of chalk soil. It's basically decomposed marine animals from 40 gazillion years ago that piled on top of each other and made chalk. So if you're ever using like chalk on the chalkboard, if it's real chalk, it's like skeletons of sea urchins. Gruet is a French family who sent out their kids to expatriate money. Very successful, also great Pinot Noir. Yeah, so Gruet, I think they make the wine in New Mexico and they buy it from either Washington or California. They buy the grapes from there, or they buy the finished base wines and send it in tanker trucks. I don't know, but it's cool. I don't know, it works. Let's see. I guess we'll have time for like 3 more questions if anybody has them. If you're ever looking for champagne and you want to try some, you're welcome to contact me. I love champagne, as you have gathered, and can recommend champagne at kind of any level or style combination. So unless it's like a Doux champagne from 1946, I can probably find it. My favorites, if you're looking for things to try, of course, the Bonnet Ponson that I import is very delicious. I would also look at trying as many different styles as you can. So try a sweet champagne, try a blended rosé, a Saignée Rosé, maybe a single vintage wine, maybe a Blanc de Blanc or Blanc de Noir. So kind of explore the different styles. And I'll just give you my contact info one more time. Is Nick, N-I-C-K, at mediumplus.com, or my phone number, 206-369-4927. So I'll stay on the call another minute or two, but we'll call this the end, and I'll hope to see you again.